Imagine you are standing on a flat, featureless beach. The sand stretches for miles in either direction. There is nowhere to hide. Above you, the sky belongs entirely to your enemy. Behind you, an army, the German Wehrmacht, is closing in from three sides. In front of you, the cold gray waters of the English Channel. You have no food, very little ammunition. You have not slept in days, and you are not alone. Around you, crowded into the dunes, jostling in columns that stretch as far as the eye can see, are approximately 400,000 men. This is Dunkirk, May 1940, and what happens on this beach in the next 9 days will determine whether the Second World War continues or ends here. Only weeks earlier, these same men had been living what many described, without a trace of irony, as a kind of holiday. Since September 1939, the British Expeditionary Force, the BEF, had been stationed in northern France, waiting for a war that seemed determined not to arrive. Historian Matt Broggie records soldiers attending tennis clubs, visiting nightclubs, going on shopping expeditions. One captain purchased a tennis racket on May 9th. He wrote in his diary that it was, perhaps, an optimistic gesture. He was correct. On May 10th, 1940, Adolf Hitler launched Fall Gelb, Case Yellow. 7 armored divisions, concentrated at a single point, punched through the Ardennes forest, terrain that Allied commanders had considered impassable, terrain they had left virtually undefended. Within days, the German Panzers had crossed the Meuse, reached the English Channel at Abbeville, and sliced the Allied armies in two. The BEF was not retreating. It was being consumed. If those 400,000 men were destroyed on the beaches of Dunkirk, if the core of Britain's professional army was annihilated, there would be no army left to defend the British Isles, no army left to fight. The war, for all practical purposes, ends here. The stakes have never been higher. And then, at the very moment of absolute German supremacy, something extraordinary happened. They stopped. On May 24, 1940, Hitler issued what history would come to call the Halt Order, in German, the Haltbefehl. The armored divisions, the very panzers that had shattered the Western Front and driven the BEF into its Kessel, its encirclement pocket, were ordered to stand down. For 3 days, from May 24th to May 26th, the most powerful mechanized force in the world sat idle, within sight of Dunkirk's church spires. Military historians have debated this decision for over 80 years. Andrew Roberts describes it as causing the greatest storm of protest among German generals of the entire Second World War. The Army's Chief of Staff, Halder, recorded his fury in his diary. The left wing, he wrote, had been stopped dead on the direct orders of the Führer. Finishing the encircled army was to be left entirely to the Luftwaffe. Here is the critical tension. Hermann Göring, commander of the Luftwaffe, had promised Hitler that his air force alone could destroy the trapped Allied forces. It was an act of institutional ambition. The Luftwaffe wanted the glory of finishing what the army had started. It probably suited Hitler, who habitually kept his subordinates competing against one another to prevent any unified challenge to his authority. But the Halt Order was not simply the product of vanity. There were genuine operational arguments in its favor. The Panzers had advanced at extraordinary speed. They needed maintenance, their crews were exhausted, and the marshy terrain around Dunkirk was poorly suited to armored warfare. Much more importantly, Hitler was already thinking past Dunkirk. His next operation, the conquest of the rest of France, required those tank divisions to be intact and ready. Destroying them in the marshes of Flanders was an unacceptable risk. There is one further element, rarely acknowledged. Hitler genuinely believed, at this moment, that Britain would sue for peace. He told Rundstedt that all he wanted from the British was an acknowledgement of Germany's continental position. He saw no reason to destroy an army he expected to surrender diplomatically within weeks. As one of his biographers records, the continuing evacuation simply did not seem to perturb him. He responded almost lackadaisically. He was catastrophically wrong. But that miscalculation bought the Allies approximately 72 hours. While Hitler contemplated a negotiated peace and Göring's bombers struggled against deteriorating weather over the Channel, a very different kind of operation was already underway beneath the chalk cliffs of Dover. Carved into those cliffs, 13 stories above the harbor, accessible through a network of tunnels that a cipher officer at the time described as a rabbit warren of dark, dreary, damp, and airless passages, sat the headquarters of Vice Admiral Bertram Ramsay, the man who would orchestrate one of the most complex naval operations in history. Ramsay was, by any measure, the right man in the right place. He had been retrieved from retirement. The Navy had placed him on their retired list after a principled resignation years earlier, and given command of Dover in 1938. In his first assessment of the port, he had produced what was described as a devastating analysis of neglect. The harbor was silted up, the defenses deplorable. The command possessed neither a telephone nor a typewriter. Over £3 million were spent on its remediation before the war began. On May 26th, Ramsay activated Operation Dynamo. His target? Evacuate as many men as possible before the Kessel collapsed entirely. His estimate, given the military situation, was that perhaps 45,000 could be saved. He had 1 week to prove that wrong. Now, here is where popular history has, not lied exactly, but significantly simplified the record, and this is important. The iconic image of Dunkirk, the image that dominates films and popular imagination, is the little ships, the armada of small civilian vessels, yachts and motor launches and Thames pleasure boats, sailing heroically to the rescue. That image is not wrong, it is incomplete. There was one final factor that military histories mention almost in passing, but which deserves emphasis. The English Channel, in those 9 days, was unusually, miraculously calm. A storm of any significance would have prevented the small craft from operating, would have made beach embarkations impossible, and might well have reduced the total evacuated to the 45,000 Ramsay had originally feared. The weather, in the most literal sense, saved the British Army. If you are watching this and finding it useful, if military history told with this level of operational detail is what you come here for, then subscribing to History by Marcus takes 3 seconds and costs you nothing. And leave me a comment below. Do you think the Halt order was Hitler's strategic blunder or a rational decision? I read every response. Here's the question that is almost never asked in British accounts of Dunkirk. Who was holding the perimeter while the evacuation took place? The answer, in large part, is France. As the bulk of the BEF filed toward the beaches, the Kessel was held by a combination of British rearguard units and, critically, the French First Army. These men were not evacuating. They were fighting, in fixed positions, against sustained German pressure, so that the men on the beaches would have time to board their ships. The Siege of Lille stands as perhaps the most costly and least celebrated episode of the entire campaign. The French First Army, tens of thousands of men, was encircled not at Dunkirk but further south, around the city of Lille. They did not surrender until June 1st, 4 full days into Operation Dynamo. For 4 days they fixed 4 German divisions in place, 4 divisions that would otherwise have been available to close the Dunkirk pocket entirely. The German general commanding the besieging force reportedly rendered his French counterpart full military honors at the surrender. It was the acknowledgement of a soldier who understood what had just been accomplished. One historian's account of the final days at Dunkirk makes the cost achingly clear. The French defenders of the perimeter, promised evacuation in return for holding the line, largely did not make it. The gallant soldiers who had held the perimeter for others to be evacuated faced German imprisonment, while some who had hidden in the dunes, men who had avoided the fighting, managed to board the last ships. It is, in the words of one account, a tragedy heaped upon tragedy. Without the French rearguard sacrifice, without the siege of Lille, without the men who held the perimeter knowing they would not see England, there would have been no miracle. There would only have been a catastrophe. On the night of Sunday, June 2, 1940, Winston Churchill was dictating the speech he would deliver to the House of Commons 2 days later. His personal secretary, Mary Shearburn, recorded what happened when he reached the conclusion. Working through the agonies of envisioning a Britain crushed under Nazi rule, he listed, quietly, the responses. He was, she remembered, racked by grief for his stricken land. He could not continue. A full minute passed in silence. Then, at full strength, with, as she remembered, all the tears gone from his voice, came the words that would not simply galvanize a nation, but change the course of the war. We shall never surrender. Operation Dynamo had ended, technically, in military defeat. 338,226 men had been saved, but the entire equipment of the British Expeditionary Force, 38,000 vehicles, 475 tanks, 90,000 rifles, 1,000 heavy guns, lay abandoned in France. As Churchill himself warned Parliament that day, wars are not won by evacuations. But the BEF survived. The professional core of Britain's army, exhausted, unarmed, stripped of its equipment, stepped off those ships and onto British soil. Within months, it would be rebuilt. Within years, it would return to the continent. The men who came home from Dunkirk would form the experienced backbone of an army that, 4 years later, would land on the beaches of Normandy. The debacle at Dunkirk was not, in the end, an ending. It was a beginning. Vice Admiral Ramsay, writing to his wife as Operation Dynamo closed, captured it in 9 words. "The relief is stupendous. The results are beyond belief." That is the full story of Operation Dynamo. Not the myth, not the Hollywood version, but the operational history. The Halt order, the naval architecture, the little ship's myth versus reality, and the French sacrifice that made survival possible. If this is the kind of military history you want more of, subscribing to History by Marcus is the best way to support this work. The link is right there. It takes 3 seconds. And tell me in the comments, which figure from this story do you think history has most undervalued? Ramsay? The French First Army? The men who held Lille? I read every single response. See you in the next one.